there are certainly some similarities in the way that Chinese and Indian firms operate in Africa. Again, using Africa as an example here of a set of emerging markets. Africa, of course, is a continent, it's not a country. We have to keep that in mind. One of the similarities is relative to European firms and US firms and African firms, which were the control groups studied in the book. Chinese and Indian firms tended to climb the value chain in exports out of Africa. And that is actually a really important finding because they have been helping Africa get out of the trap of exporting raw commodities. And so if you compare the average type of good or product that is being exported out of these African countries by Chinese and Indian firms, they tend to be more processed and create more value added on the continent prior to their being exported. Well, they also turn out to have a lot of horizontal integration across different countries in Africa, which is again very important. This comes from emerging market firms understanding how their own home environments dictate and condition how they look at a foreign environment. So they tended to operate in different horizontal markets across Africa, which is, I say, important because one of the curses of Africa is that it's a set of a large number of countries that are landlocked, but they are not integrated. And that, of course, is the genesis for the current Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, is to try to create an integrated market. And I think India and Chinese firms have been actually very important ingredients in furthering that integration. And it also turns out that not only are the Indian and Chinese firms able to help Africans climb the value chains before exporting, in the places in which they are investing, those markets tend to be more export intensive because India and China, compared to the average, in quotes, African country, are integrated into the world market. So they both have been really significant generators of exports out of Africa. Well, so much for the similarities. I think what is particularly interesting is what the differences are. And these differences are quite striking. And to be honest with you, when you look at how Chinese and Indian firms are operating in other markets around the world, particularly other emerging markets, but not necessarily only those, these differences tend to be replicated in other markets. So again, I think of Africa as just a case study here, but it has extraordinarily important implications in other geographies where we're comparing how Chinese and Indian firms are competing in those markets, and not just competing against each other, but competing against world-class firms from the advanced countries. Chinese firms tend to be state-owned enterprises operating abroad, particularly in Africa. They get dictates from home as to which markets they can enter or should enter into. And so you find that the African market is segmented. So a steel company coming out of one province in China is not going to be competing with a steel company coming out of another province of China, because ultimately, of course, they're all part of the Communist Party. The Communist Party is not necessarily the greatest run organization, but one thing they do well is they carve up where their firms are going to be operating abroad so as to minimize competition against one another. So you find a lot of segmentation between Chinese firms operating in Africa, but you don't find that at all in the case of Indian firms. Indian firms are quite happy to compete with one another in third countries, just like they do at home. The firms from China also tend to be, as I mentioned before, quite large, whereas in the case of India, the firms that are operating in Africa are a much varied size and scale. Yes, to be sure, there are some very large Indian firms operating in Africa, but you do see a lot of so-called mom and pop stores throughout Africa. There are some of that in the case of China, but these tend to be appendages to the SOEs, and they tend to be catering more to the SOEs in the African countries than the African population per se. The way that Indian and Chinese firms enter into Africa is also very interesting. Indian firms are not afraid to acquire existing African firms or European firms or US subsidiaries, whereas virtually all of the Chinese firms entering into Africa are de novo. They're greenfield investments. And again, that's a very different business strategy, if you will, that distinguishes how India and China operate abroad. Probably one of the most interesting findings of the work, and it's still very much true today, is Chinese firms tend to be extraordinarily vertically integrated as they operate in Africa. That is to say, rather than buy their inputs on the open market, if you will, whether it's merchandise or whether it's hiring workers, they're quite risk averse. And so much of their inputs are being shipped through their internal channels from China or from other countries where a Chinese company might be making something. So there is a high degree of vertical integration on the part of Chinese companies. In the case of Indian firms, they are less timid about procuring supplies on the open market through local products, workers, and the like. And in my view, this really is quite emblematic of the different risk profiles and risk aversion profiles between Chinese firms on the one hand and Indian firms on the other. Indian firms tend to be much greater risk takers than Chinese firms. And again, owing to who the owners are of these firms, you would not be surprised to see these differences. In the case of workers, we see many stories in the press about lots of workers in Chinese firms coming from China, doing their time. It's almost like the American Foreign Service or maybe the Indian Foreign Service, doing their time working in a state-owned enterprise in Africa, and then going back home to China. That is indeed true, but again, it's part of the risk aversion factor, I think, that the Chinese have. Now, obviously, Indian firms will also employ Indians, but they are far more receptive about hiring local workers as part of their enterprise on the ground in Africa and indeed in other countries in which they work. And that brings me to another finding, again, I think, which is part of a consistent story, is that Indians in Africa are quite infiltrating, in a good way, the socioeconomic fabric of Indian society, whereas the Chinese, if one can generalize, tend to operate as in enclaves. And so you find Chinese communities sometimes within the confines of the state-owned enterprise plant where they are living, and they rarely mix with Africans, not because of racist issues, although I'm not ruling that out on the part of any society, but I think they feel more comfortable, socializing among themselves. In the case of India, that you find just the opposite. Indians have, as I say, entered into the socioeconomic fabric in African countries. Part of that is as a historical matter because India has a longer history living and working. Indians have a longer history of living and working on the continent than Chinese firms. But it also shows that there's a very different philosophy and culture, as I mentioned at the outset, that the Indians bring to the foreign markets in which they work. And one of the variables that we measured in the study was, we asked the CEOs of the 450 firms, how many of you have African passports? Because we wanted to get a quantitative indicator rather than a perception. How much do you feel like you're an African, right? And it turned out, in both cases, India and China, the number of CEOs that had African passports was very low, but the ratio was extraordinarily different. By far, Indians had far more African passports, in part from marriage, but also because they decided to become citizens in Africa. It was rarely the case in China that you find that. And to me, looking at quantitative indicators like that rather than perception-based indexes tells you a lot about how people are operating, how businesses are conducting business in foreign markets. Another sort of difference is because the Chinese firms are these state-owned enterprises, they are quite active in state procurement bids in the African countries, whereas Indian firms do that, but nothing quite like the Chinese firms do. And you would not be surprised to learn that in most of the bids in which Chinese state-owned enterprises participate in in Africa, they win. Well, why do they win? In part because they're subsidized and they're able to strike a much lower price. They're subsidized by their home government, and so they're able to outbid virtually every other competitor. And one of the stories that came out of the case studies was this was a construction firm in Africa, I think it was in Kenya. He has decided with his company to actually team up with the Chinese because he said, well, I'd much rather be part of a Chinese procurement bid if they're going to be subsidizing us so we can win the bid. And he said to me, he said, if you can't beat them, join them. And so what you find is that some of the African firms in this public procurement market have realized, well, we better try not to outcompete with China because we're never going to do so. We might as well engage in JVs with them, which is what they have done. And then the final thing I would say is part of the case studies. As I say, we interviewed many CEOs, and I also asked the question, how do you see your firm as part of African society? How do you brand yourself in the local market? And I would say, the vast majority of the Indian CEOs that we interviewed said, we want to be seen as an African firm. That is a strikingly different response than what we got from the plant managers and the CEOs of the Chinese firms operating in Africa. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, a review of the findings that was in this book, Africa's Silk Road, and I say have been updated since. And I think it's a story that you can replicate, not exactly the same, but replicate in other markets, and tells you a lot about the different ways in which Indian firms and Chinese firms compete outside of their home markets.